Hey, here's a question that nobody asks at CHRO performance review time. Not the CEO, not the board, not the search firm that placed you. The question is, what percentage of your time do you spend outside of the HR function? Not your intention, not the aspiration, the calendar. Because there's a version of CHRO performance that looks completely healthy. Low attrition, strong engagement scores, no compliance fires, happy business partners, and it still represents a complete strategic failure. The failure is that the most expensive HR resource in the building spent the year running the function. And nobody ever asked whether that was the job.
Hey there, senior leader, and welcome to the Talent Sherpa podcast, where senior leaders come to rethink how human capital really works. I'm your host, Jackson Lynch, and today I am joined by my co-host, Scott Morris. He's a former CHRO with a scar tissue to prove it, who has personally shed payroll twice and remains suspicious that it might come back a third time, and the founder of Propulsion AI.
Thanks, Jackson. I hate when I have to do this, but I gotta start with a confession. I have spent a part of my professional career, not as big a part as you have, but coaching other CHROs. And a part of that coaching is to get the work where it actually belongs. Payroll to finance, compliance to legal, benefits administration out of the CHRO's line of sight. And every time the CHRO says, I'm so glad we finally did that. And I say, I can't believe we spent this much time fighting about it first.
Which is exactly the problem. Been there, brother. It's what we're going to be unpacking today. Because the conversation in this industry for the past decade, this function, has been pointing in the right direction. Be more strategic, get closer to the business, think like an enterprise leader, and all of that is absolutely correct. None of it, however, is measurable. And no one ever said, here's the test that you can run on yourself to figure out whether you're actually doing the thing.
Well, when there is no test, you can always tell yourself you're doing fine. The calendar looks full, the team looks busy, the CEO isn't complaining, so it must be working.
So today we're gonna give you the test. We're gonna talk about how you measure whether you are leading human capital or managing an HR function, and those aren't the same thing, right? And we're gonna do it with enough specificity that you can walk out of this episode, look at your own calendar, and you'll know the answer.
And that's a good thing. But before we get into it, take a second, because every week your community keeps growing, and it keeps growing because the people who do the work then show up here to go deeper. And so I wanted to shout out, and this week's shout out goes to Rebecca from my town of Denver, Colorado. Rebecca, you're in this, and we see you. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for making the show what it is. Thank you for being a continued listener.
Yeah, Rebecca, that is for you and for everyone listening, whether you found us last week or if you've been here since the beginning. This is the community that makes it all worth building. The reviews, the messages, the people who sent a note saying the episode changed how they walked into a conversation that week. I get goosebumps. That is why we are doing it. You're why we're doing it, and I just want to say thank you. Okay, sappy intro over. Let's get into it. So let's start with the environment, Scott. There's no shortage of research telling CHROs to be more strategic. Like the McKinsey HR Monitor from 25 puts it plainly, only 12% of HR leaders report spending the majority of their time on enterprise-wide business problems. The rest are running the function. And when you ask them why, the answer is almost always the same. Because the function needs it. My peers expect it, and I can't break free.
And the function is always going to need it. That's not a temporary condition that you can solve. The function has an infinite appetite for senior HR attention. If you are available, the function is going to fill that time for you. The only way out of it is a deliberate standard for how you allocate yourself.
And look, I've been saying for a long time that a CHRO role, if it's properly executed, should look like at least 50% of your time is spent outside of the HR function. Not 50% of your intention, your actual calendar, because the calendar is the great truth arbiter. The calendar is the only leadership artifact that does not lie. It will tell you what you have been doing.
I don't really think I thought about the amount of time until you and I started talking about it. And when I first heard you say 50%, that kind of stopped me. Because I think, the average CHRO would tell you there is just no way I can spend 50% of my time not associated with running the function, maybe 20% on a good week. But that gap between where they think they should be and where the calendar actually is, that gap is a strategy problem.
Yeah, and here's what I think makes it harder to measure than most people expect. Not all time outside the function counts. So I use 3 categories when I work with the people that I'm coaching on how to audit the calendar. Time spent managing the HR function, which is kind of execution inside the tent. Time spent aligning to the business. And these are meetings that touch strategy, their relationships with the leadership team, they're connecting HR decisions to enterprise priorities. This is time that just because you're meeting with a senior person doesn't mean that it is strategic time. Okay. You're still worried about execution. And then the third bucket is time spent actually changing the work, which is, how to restructure the capability building, the initiatives that actually alter how the organization operates. So think about the time figuring out how to improve talent density in revenue roles in an organization that's about ready to go through a market expansion. So I think the first bucket should be shrinking. The problem is when you get into this job for the first time, you've been promoted largely as a result of that very first bucket. The more senior you get, the more balanced that second bucket comes in. But in reality, once you get into the seat, it's the second and third buckets. That's where the CHRO job lives.
I don't know whether I've ever told you this for all the times that we've talked about it. I color code my calendar as well. And I am, as you know, really stringent about getting everything onto the calendar, but it's so I can see exactly what you're talking about. And I've coached other people to do that same thing. It's a hard discipline to start, but once you get going, it gets a lot easier. The one common mistake that I see constantly is people who are counting alignment meetings as strategic time. You were, for example, in the room with the CFO and you talked about the people agenda and you walk out feeling like you had a business conversation, but you went in to report on HR activity and you left without changing how the business is operating. And so that's a management meeting with a more senior audience. The altitude of the person that is across the table from you doesn't determine the altitude of the work.
Yeah, exactly. And the label on the meeting doesn't tell you what you were doing either. So the question is whether you shifted anything. Did a decision get made? Did a constraint get named? Did a priority change because you were in the room? If so, that's great. If not, you attended a meeting, you did not change the business.
And I think what you got to do is be honest with that when you're categorizing that on the calendar, and you'll learn over time to start how to, making those things move. Here's what's hard to fix. Most CHROs don't think about themselves as HR managers. They think about themselves, including, I think, you and me, as HR leaders. And there's a real identity question that's embedded in that, because the people on your team are watching what you protect. They're watching what you spend time on. And if you step back from operational work, it can feel like you stopped caring about the function.
And that pull is real. And part of the thing you have to talk about with your team is where you are focused. And it, by the way, no one likes it when I say half the job has nothing to do with kind of working with you. I have a completely different job because you came up through the work. You built the team. The people in the function, look, they're yours in a way that goes beyond a reporting line if you have half an ounce of leadership capability. And that responsibility, when it becomes unbounded, becomes the mechanism through which your function, unfortunately, reclaims your calendar.
I've had a CHRO, at least one, say to me, I should support my team. And the answer to that is obvious, right? Yes, you should. But there's also a significant difference between supporting your team and being involved in the work at a functional altitude more than you absolutely have to. Support means that your team can do the work independently with guidance and direction from you.
Yeah, this is also, I think, where the vague mandate becomes really dangerous. Look, most CEOs want a CHRO who is, quote, a strategic partner, close quote. Like, most CHROs agree to that description without ever asking what it
Huh.
means, right? The CFO, incidentally, would not accept that. If you told a CFO you wanted them to be a strategic financial partner, the CEO would naturally say, what decisions do you want me to be in on, right? What authority do I have? What success is, what would success look like at the end of the year? And the CFO would ask sufficient questions to make that mandate legible before agreeing to it. The CEO oftentimes describes what a CHRO does as this unicorn. We want you to manage at an unbelievably detailed level and be strategic. The problem is if you don't define what strategic means, you will default to the stuff that you know and is tangible. Like you would never have a CFO talk about, well, I want to make sure that you are knee deep in the cash collection process. But they say that to us all the time. And part of the reason is we say yes. And then we figured out along the way that is, I've seen the problem. It is ourselves.
You and I are both guilty of that, of this. And I don't think we're different than anybody who is listening in this regard. You know, I've worked inside organizations where the role was defined loosely, and I operated in ambiguity rather than surfacing it. And it was a mistake, but surfacing it is uncomfortable. It sometimes puts the CEO on the spot. Doesn't feel good to do that to your boss. Feels really uncomfortable. It makes you look difficult sometimes if you're not accepting the ambiguity, if you're pushing for the answer. But the ambiguity is where, you know, it's the altitude where the problem lives.
And let me really reinforce this. The vague mandate's not neutral. It defaults to functional management. So unless you define it at a different altitude, it will always lead you back to being a good HR person. Because that's what always has been measured. It's what the organization expects. They know how to reward it. So if you don't define what leading human capital looks like with a great level of specificity, you will spend your career being very good at something that is worth less than what it otherwise could be.
Yeah.
So I think the question is, how can this happen at a mechanical level? And how do capable leaders end up spending 80% or more of their time inside the function when they know they should be spending the majority of time outside of it?
Okay. Well, so you and I like to come up with fancy names for things because it makes them more concrete. And I would call this one the evaluation default loop. And, you know, imagine this. Say it again.
I said that does sound fancy.
I'm telling you, fancy names, man. Evaluation default loop. A new CHRO comes in, and at the most visible early activity is assessment. Is the function healthy? Where are the gaps? Where are the risks? You know, that's legitimate phase one activity. And the problem is that the evaluation loop never closes. There's always something else to assess. A new compliance exposure, a new organizational design question, a new retention problem. So the CHRO stays in diagnostic mode, kind of like indefinitely, which feels like rigor, but it's functionally management.
Well, you're right. And the cycle trap that's underneath that says it all. Because the evaluation surfaces problems, the problems produce urgency, urgency produces involvement. So the more thoroughly you assess, the more reasons you generate to stay close to the function, and the calendar fills up with what is urgent, unless you have an unbelievable amount of discipline. And next thing you know, you have stuff that is on your calendar that is familiar rather than something that is important and unfamiliar.
And, you know, you use this word all the time, and I think it's the right word. You know, it's gravity. It is going to pull you. The function exerts a gravitational pull over your time. It's not malicious. It's not, you know, trying to do bad things to you. It's structural. The friction's immediate. It's visible. It's full of real people with real problems. And it's the domain where every CHRO can demonstrate competence instantly. And that feels really, really good. Because I'll tell you, on the other side of it, enterprise leadership is a lot slower. It's a lot less visible. It feels a lot more ambiguous. It doesn't feel always like you're making progress. And when you can choose between, demonstrating how competent you are right now and operating in ambiguity, I'll tell you what, man, the calendar is going to make that choice for you unless you override it deliberately.
So here's the test I use. It's a real estate test. So look at your calendar for the last 90 days. Audit your calendar. People make fun of me because I want to audit everything, but it's the mirror that you got to use. So this one helps you understand where the majority of your time was spent. Who called the meetings? Who was in the room? And if most of the calendar was called by direct reports or HR functional partners or line leaders trying to talk about execution of your team, you're managing the function. Yeah. If you are not in the room that requires you and only you for a decision or an insight, at some point you are involved way deeper than you need to be. I don't mean to kind of get ahead of us here, but think about that, what that calendar looks like. Now, by comparison, if you have a calendar where most of it was called by business leaders or peer executives or the boss or a board member around enterprise problems, not HR problems, then you're leading human capital. The real estate of your calendar tells you what job you are actually doing. And there's no magic in that 50%, but I've been doing this for 12 years plus now, I guess.
Jackson, this is what
you spend your time.
It's why I color code, because it makes it immediately obvious when you scan the calendar week by week by week, especially if you take a week-long view of the calendar, you can see where you're spending your time. You can make adjustments for the next week or for the week after that. I think there's another thing here to be named too. And there's an invisibility standard that I think kind of runs throughout this. The question, and it's a hard question to ask yourself honestly, but it's an important one. If you disappeared from the HR function for a week, would things break? Because if the answer to that is yes, that is not a success. That's a design failure. The CHRO's job is to build a function that doesn't require the CHRO's constant presence to operate. That's when you're going to have the time to fill up with the strategic aspect of the job. If the function can't run without you, you've built a dependency. It's not a team.
Yeah, and this connects to something you raised earlier. I can't remember if it was on the podcast or in our pre-call, but I want to make sure that you get full credit for it. It's not enough to say you want your team to be more capable or more strategic or whatever word you use. You actually have to build that capability by defining the roles in the function by outputs, right? Not, I want a more strategic HRBP. No one knows what the heck that means. You have to describe how you want someone to talk. So the question that I think, Scott, you would have us ask is, what does a strategic HRBP deliver? What are the outcomes? What exists in the world at the end of the quarter because this person did their job well? And until you can answer that, you haven't defined the role. You've described an aspiration and probably a list of tasks, which doesn't matter whether you're good or bad, you can still accomplish the task. And if you are only doing tasks, you as the leader must always insert yourself to play the coordination effort. And the CHRO doesn't have the latitude to do that if you want to play at high altitude.
I think it's really good that you brought that up, because the distinction between task and outcome is critically important. It's not just the language that you use to describe it. When the CHRO's role is defined by outcomes, the team's roles can be designed by or defined by outcomes. And when the team's roles are defined by outcomes, then accountability becomes structural rather than relational. You stop depending on good people with good intentions. You don't need heroes anymore to get the work done. You're building a system that produces regardless of who holds the seats.
So here's what we want to push on, I think, on the framing. The human resource industry has been talking about this strategic partner for, 15 years, business partner since 1996 when Dave Ulrich put it together. And I'm here. I come not to praise Caesar, but to bury him. It's time to put the language in the ground. It's run its course. And that's not because it was wrong directionally, but because it was never specific enough to actually act on.
It tells you how to position yourself, the term strategic partner, but it doesn't tell you what to do. It's more like an identity label. It's not an operating instruction for certain.
Yeah. And so we're not just criticizing, we have a different proposal. The frame we're proposing is a business operator that owns the human capital agenda. That's a different accountability structure than partnership. A partner can be in the room without changing the outcome. An operator is accountable for what the system produces.
And you know what else it's not? It's not service provider. It's fiduciary, right? If you think about what a business operator does, they have a scorecard. It's a set of metrics that tell them whether their part of the enterprise is working. Financial, operational, talent specific, right? If that scorecard doesn't exist for your function, then your calendar is going to fill itself with what can be measured, which is all of the activity, which is all of the transactional, which is all of the run the function. Because organizations optimize for the visible. And if the only visible things in HR are operational, then the CHRO becomes an operator of the HR business process by default.
So I got an email last night from my friend Carrie over at True Search. Hi, Carrie. I know she listens. And it was a job spec, and she was asking if I was interested in it. And so the first thing I do when I look at new job opportunities, I want to say, what are the expected delivered outcomes? Mm-hmm. And I usually see the same stuff. And on the very first one I saw that she sent me on the spec, it was improve talent density in pivotal roles from 40% to 90%. I don't care anything else about that company. I'm interested, right?
Totally.
Because you know all of the stuff that comes in. And by the way, this isn't Carrie that's kind of hard wiring, because I've seen plenty of things from that firm that don't have that on the top of the list. But what it speaks very specifically to is I now know that I have a high altitude, outcome oriented CEO that understands what we do. And it was like really excited. Because on the contrary, you don't get to complain about not being taken seriously as an enterprise leader if you haven't built a scorecard. And that's the CFO standard. CFO doesn't walk into the boardroom and say, I think I've been adding a lot of value. They don't walk in talking about how awesome it is that they were able to collect a lot of cash. The CFO walks in with numbers and not activities. The CHRO needs numbers. They need numbers that are enterprise. And I'm not talking about engagement scores or voluntary attrition and isolation. Those are largely vanity metrics, or they don't actually lead to an outcome. You need numbers that are going to connect talent decisions to revenue, output, execution, risk, capability, concentration, those kind of things. That's how you can tell.
You know, it's like listening to you describe that. It's hard for me to not get excited when I hear that that's the first thing, talent density, and that there was a specific and measurable number that was connected to it. But anybody listening right now should immediately say, okay, it's going to take time to do that. If you're running the function, you don't have that time. When you build a function that can run without your constant presence, when you define roles that work in your function by their outputs rather than their activity, and when you own the scorecard that connects human capital to enterprise performance, you have not merely repositioned yourself. You have built the conditions that make the other altitude possible. You know, the function doesn't need you at the tactical level anymore because you've got clear outcomes for your people. They are delivering on those operational and tactical priorities. And you now have the time to go off and think about a really hard question, like how am I going to move this talent density? The business does need you at the strategic level, and that scorecard provides the connection.
So the question for every CHRO is this: if somebody audited your calendar right now, would they see a business operator, or would they see a very senior HR manager with a better title and more equity? Not what you intend, not what you can do, not what you want to do. Like, what does the calendar show? Like, I can talk all the time about how I'm eating better and I'm exercising more. And yet there's this thing I step on every morning. It tells me with great truth how much progress I've made. Like, that's the calendar in this spot, because the calendar tells you what your real job today is. And if you want to change the job, you got to change the calendar.
And sometime you and I have to do an episode on the difference between leading indicators and trailing indicators and where those things are important. Both are, but where they play importance. Let's, instead of doing that now, let's turn this thing into a playbook. Moves that CHROs can make starting Monday morning, 3 plays, you take it.
Yeah. So play one is where Scott and I have to be honest with you about the fact that we came at this from 2 different parts. So a little behind the scenes action. When we do a podcast, we talk earlier in the week and we kind of make sure that we're aligned and we're thinking about what we're going to go do. And we came to the playbook and we said, okay, here are the 1, 2, 3, 4. And Scott said 1, 2, 3, 4. Then we normally spend about 15 minutes on this, and 45 minutes later, we're still arguing about what play one is. So
yes.
So what I want to do is give you both. And because I'm a gentleman and a scholar, Scott, why don't you set it up?
Okay. So the two here are focus on the constraint first or focus on your calendar first. My point of view is before you redesign your calendar, you have to know what is holding the current one in place. You have to sit down and name the 5 things that are consuming your time as a CHRO that are not enterprise level activities. And for most people, those 5 things are real, but you've got to understand what it is that you need to let go of. You know, a team member who is not ready to own their own scope. That could be one of them. A business partner who escalates everything instead of owning it. I guess that's kind of like the first one, right? A process that requires you as the CHRO to sign off that you probably don't need to be the person signing off on. A CEO who calls you for the things that should belong to the COO. That could be one too. A legacy program that you personally built that, you feel like you've got ownership over. Right? You've got to name those things. And I think you have to name them first because you can't redesign around the constraints, the things that are holding you back, unless you're present to what they are.
And while you're doing that constraint audit, you need to, I guess, design the calendar in parallel. Here's what I think we're trying to say at the same time. If you wait for the constraints to be resolved before you block the calendar, then you're going to be waiting for a very long time. Constraints don't resolve themselves on their own timeline. And you have to have the true north. And so you mentioned some tactical things. I agree with all of those. In our pre-call, we talked a little bit more broadly about look at the business strategy through a talent lens, identify the constraint, and then figure out what that true north is, or at least what constellation you're going to be driving toward, and develop that so that when you free up time on your calendar to put them in. Like I still think you need to find time in the calendar first, because that actually is more challenging, because the calendar pressure makes them resolve. And so like if you can find a way to block out Tuesday and Thursday afternoons for enterprise leadership work, then the function is going to have to figure out what they're going to be doing that you otherwise would have been doing. And forgive me for probably not saying this as clearly, but I think you need to figure out, how do I free up time to work on the stuff that matters? And then concurrently with that, you can figure out what matters and make sure that it frees the time. And if you focus on the constraint, I worry about setting expectations outside the function or even inside that's not there. I just think you have to find the time first. That's what I coach my folks on. And once you figure out where in the organization you need to focus and you've found the time, you're going to very quickly figure out which gaps are real and which ones existed because you were available.
Well, look, and this is where I think you and I came to the point of view that you have to do both of these. You just got to block your calendar. You just got to do it, because if you don't, nothing is ever going to happen. You're going to be constantly in this drawing of the future, but you also have to know where you're going.
Yeah, but Scott, let me jump in. You do have to block the calendar, but the key thing is figure out what you stop doing in order to free that time up. That's the point I'm trying to nudge us on.
Well, but I think where you and I came out, Jackson, is you got to do both of them. And so it's not one or the other. And you probably do them both at the same time, right? You're constantly running the audit and you're constantly redesigning the calendar, and you're figuring out what it is that you should be doing. What's the business constraint that you should be focused on? And they self-reinforce. The calendar creates urgency on the constraint side. The constraint audit tells you exactly what to anticipate as the calendar changes that you're making go into effect. And I think that's really as difficult as it is. Two of them, that's the twofer. What's the next play?
I think practically you got to look at the last 4 weeks. And for every meeting that required your presence, ask 3 questions. Could this have been handled by a direct report? Could this have been eliminated with a better process design? Or could this have been a business leader's call without us even being involved? That's where this partnership nonsense that we talk about a lot, I think works against us. When I've done this with my coaching clients, I found 30 to 40% of the calendar is easily recoverable. It's uncomfortable, but it can be done without changing any of the outputs. And that's not a small number. That's like Tuesday and Thursday.
That's a big time gain back in your week. And I think, the other thing that you have to do is, the constraints that don't resolve themselves quickly, you've got to name them explicitly. And, to a certain degree, I think you got to go to your CEO and say, look, here are 3 things that are structurally limiting my ability to operate at the enterprise altitude that you and I both want me at. Here's what I'm going to do about each one of these. And I'm here to align with you and check to make sure that you and I are on the same page about removing these constraints, because it's not like they're going to be without short-term disruption, and having that as an explicit conversation. That conversation is an enterprise leadership activity. I think a lot of CHROs don't ever have that.
And what happens if the CEO pushes back?
Well, then you understand another constraint, right? And so you're going to have to figure that out. Like, if you don't get agreement, okay, that's a wall. So the question still remains. Are you going to continue to operate the function, or are you going to move yourself to enterprise altitude? So the next thing you're going to look at is, okay, what am I going to do about it? Right? Just like any business operator. The CFO isn't going to say, well, the banks made it really hard. The CFO is going to figure out a way around it. And we need to do it the same that they do.
Yeah. Sometimes the CFO does say that, but it's usually because you're in chapter 7.
Well,
but I digress. Look, let's move on to play 2. I think it's talent density inside the HR function. So I'm going to give you the uncomfortable truth here for a second. You may have really, really good people working for you. They may be functionally really good at what you have asked them to do historically. And I'm sure that the divine loves them. They might not be who you need in the seat for you to be able to reach your altitude. Like, you cannot manage human capital from the front if you are backstopping the team from behind. I think the goal here is to have a function where every direct report fully owns their own scope and doesn't need you outside of setting the direction and setting the walls of the sandbox.
And, Jackson, just for clarity for the audience, you and I are never advocates of people coming in and going off with their heads, right? We just got to fire everybody. But you have to be realistic with yourself. If the gap is so big that you're building them over years to be able to own the scope as you just described it, you really have to ask yourself, can the business afford that for you? And can you afford that as an HR leader? And you may have to make some different choices. You need the right people in the right roles, defined by the right outputs, with clarity about what a successful quarter looks like. That's kind of like that line in the job description saying talent density moving from this number to this number, right? No good people in ambiguous roles, good people with explicit accountability. And when that exists, then you as CHRO are free to move forward. And when it doesn't, you are going to stay close to protect the work because you have to.
Yeah. So think about it this way. If you are taking a talent density approach to your own team, like, given that you want to make the elevation change and you want to free up 30 to 50% of your calendar, the question now becomes, what are the pivotal roles in the HR function that will allow you to do that most effectively? And that's going to be different for every company, right? For every stage you're in, for every life cycle that you're in. But for each one, I think the way I would do it is ask, does the person own their scope fully? If the answer is no, then you have to figure out, is that a capability gap or a clarity gap? Clarity gap's yours. Capability gap's theirs. The fixes are different, right? If it's a capability gap, like ultimately that needs to require a talent upgrade. If it's something that can be taught really quickly, great. Figure out what the development plan is to teach it really quickly. And when I talk about quickly, I'm talking about 6 months. I've talked to tons of HR people over the years that say, well, we can get them there over time. Yeah, but there is a time box on this thing, and it should be 6 months. If you can't, candidly, they can't be in the role that you need them to get into. If it is something that is not teachable in the next 6 months, or I need someone that is able to make better decisions, or someone who has to be able to influence the business towards the right outcome or align, like, I'm sorry, some of those things that are tied to cognitive power, you just can't coach it fast enough. And you need to put them in a position. Maybe it's inside the organization, maybe it's not. You got to certainly time bound your sequence in a way that you don't like flush the entire organization, because then you've just created one set of problems for another set. But in most cases, though, I found it to be, it's a clarity gap, and that requires a better role definition, and it requires more thinking up front on your part to define the outcomes, and it requires you to be very, very clear on what the destination of that role is. But if you can do that, it's faster, and I found it to be more effective than you expect. People are operating at the levels that you've told them is acceptable. And if you change that, sometimes, a lot of times, really good people can step up. But you got to start with the clarity.
Strong role definition has outcomes. It has how success is going to be measured. It has targets. It has competencies, and it has skills. And those 5 things are absolutely critical. We've got to stop thinking about job descriptions. Those 5 things constitute the job description as one-time work. It's one of the reasons we built one of the capabilities within the Propulsion AI platform that we did, because we strongly believe that role definition is going to be dynamic. As the CHRO's altitude shifts, the function's roles shift. What a head of talent acquisition needs to deliver changes when the CHRO is spending more time on workforce design at the executive level, right? It just naturally evolves. And the role definitions have to track that strategic agenda. And you said it a second ago, and I want to double click on it because you're 100% right. The clarity gap is yours as a manager, not theirs. And so redefining those roles as the function is evolving, as your altitude is raising, is critically important.
So let's move on to play 3. And this is going to be a hard one because it's the CEO conversation. You have to, well, at least the people that I've interacted with over the last 20 years, it's the one that gets deferred most because it can be uncomfortable.
Well, the conversation's not complicated. It's 2 questions, right? I mean, and I don't mean to say that like sounding like I just contradicted what you said, because it's uncomfortable doesn't make it complicated, right? It's straightforward, but it's hard as hell to do. It's 2 questions. Question number 1, what are the 2 or 3 things? This is CHRO to CEO. What are the 2 or 3 things that you most need me doing that nobody else on the team can do? Question 2, are there things that I'm currently spending time on that you would rather that I move? Those 2 questions, I think, surface the actual CEO mandate and not the implied one. And they give you explicit permission to deprioritize what doesn't belong at your altitude.
Yeah. And I love those questions. Let me laser in on the first one. What are the 2 or 3 things you need me to be doing that no one else on your team can do? The easy default on that is HR functional stuff. Okay. That's not what we're talking about here. It is, you need to navigate that conversation with your CEO to say, okay, I need to stop filling jobs, and I need to start identifying the 5% of the jobs that matter more than others. Right. So this is not a passive exercise, I guess, is what I'm trying to get to, because unless you're dealing with an enlightened CEO, chances are your very first answer to that question is going to lead you down the wrong path. So
because they're defaulting to everything that they've had in their past. And you and I have done other episodes on that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So listen to all of our episodes and you'll catch up. Also, it's better for everybody. Anyway, the other version here, I think, is the scorecard conversation. And, here's how I currently measure the performance of the human capital agenda. Here are the 4 metrics I want you to evaluate me against. And do you agree these are the right ones? And again, it's going to take a little navigation. If you say, I want to be measured based on talent density changes over time, the CEO is not going to come up with that on their own, which is why when I find someone that does, like, you run towards that opportunity. More likely, they're going to say, I want us to help culture and reduce unnecessary turnover and improve engagement scores. Like, those are okay. You have an obligation to navigate and push that conversation where you need it. Because ultimately, if you get the CEO to agree, you have an enterprise scorecard with explicit accountability attached to it. And, I've made my recommendation over the last couple of years on what that looks like. It's around talent density, speed to impact, retention of key talent, and things that are forward looking, not things that are in the back. If the CEO ends up pushing back in that conversation, here's good news. That too is progress. You've started the conversation about what actually matters. And either way, you're still operating like a business leader, not a functional one. So good for you.
Let me one point to sort of cap that before we land this plane, Jackson, and that is the CEO that tells you what you just said. I just need you to do a better job with engagement. The simplest way to get underneath that is just why. What is it a means to an end for you? Like, how is that going to help the business that you are leading right now? That's the most effective question for that CEO.
I agree with it completely. And all right, senior leaders, it is now your favorite part of the show. It is your Talent Sherpa Summary, because Scott always leaves us with his wisdom. And this week, as we were prepping, Scott said, I knew I was finally operating at enterprise altitude the day that I realized I was the last signature on every onboarding checklist.
So just so everybody knows, like, I don't get to preview any of this summary segment that Jackson leads in with. You're so full of nonsense. All right, 4 things that we think you should take away from the episode today. 1, audit your calendar before you audit the strategy. The calendar is the truth, and it doesn't lie to you. 2, name the 5 constraints that are holding your current time allocation in place before you try and change it. 3, run the constraint audit and the calendar redesign in parallel. Don't sequence them. It's a twofer. 4, have the hard CEO conversation about your explicit mandate, not your intentions, about what you're being asked to deliver and about what you're being measured against. That's my 4.
And you said calendar doesn't lie?
Calendar doesn't lie, man.
That makes me wonder what a Shakira song about this would sound like. I think it would be amazing. But here's what, okay, I'm a little punchy. Sorry, guys. Here's the thing I keep coming back to about on this episode. I think the CHRO is a hard job, but it's not hard because it's complicated. The function isn't complicated. Okay. Sometimes we overcomplicate it, but it's not that complicated. The CHRO job is hard because the function will always be more urgent than the enterprise. And the leaders who crack this code and operate at altitude, they're living by a different standard. They build the function so that it largely runs without them. And by the way, that makes you feel a little less useful, but it's important because that allows you to own a scorecard that the business respects. It's not a functional scorecard. It's an enterprise scorecard. And the people that are doing this have the discipline to keep the calendar honest. The research says, be more strategic. We are saying build a scorecard before anybody asks you to do so. That's the step.
Yeah.
So
100%.
That's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning into the Talent Sherpa podcast, which, as I think you know by now, is where senior leaders come to rethink how human capital really works. This is so much fun. Scott, I think we're coming up on just about a year since you and I have been doing this together. And I've enjoyed the ride, brother. It's a lot of fun.
It's really hard to believe, but you know what, man? I look forward to this time that I spend with you, both prepping and doing the episode every single week. And it's amazing to watch the audience grow and to see the number of places that are listening to us. And if you want to help with that, do us a favor and hit the like button right now on this episode, or even better for us, subscribe so that you get episodes delivered directly to you. Leave us a review on your favorite platform, whether that's Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or even one of the 3 people that watches us on YouTube. We are on all of those. It benefits the community when you do those kinds of things for us. It helps the algorithm. It spreads the pod to other senior leaders. It's free. It helps you. It helps others.
Yeah, and for the record, it's 6, not 3.
There you go. Okay,
we have hundreds of folks that watch us on YouTube.
Two bald dudes are not that interesting.
No, but look, Apple has video, so if you ever wondered which of the 2 of us is more handsome, now you'll be able to make that judgment on Apple, not just on YouTube. So
don't make that the comment. Not the comment we need.
One of us likes leg day, and one of us likes donuts. So you can figure out who's who. Hey, I do want to talk a little bit about Scott's company, and that's Propulsion AI. They are workforce intelligence for private equity, and their AI teammates surface workforce risks before the deal closes, and they help leadership teams drive execution after. So whether you're in a deal or you're trying to execute your strategy, this is a group you should be able to reach out to, because they can help you translate strategy into individual accountability. And that includes coaching managers to define roles by outcomes and giving every employee a clear line of sight as to what actually matters. And if you've heard it on this pod once, you've heard it 100 times. Like, good people want to execute well, but you need to make sure that they're pointing in the right direction. That's one of the things that Scott's company does. And it's good stuff. It's all through artificial intelligence. And you can learn more at the very cleverly named getpropulsion.ai.
If you are a new CHRO, or if you're preparing to step into the role for the first time, Jackson has built a bunch of tools to help you operate at the altitude that the role demands. Personal coaching, the CHRO Ascent Academy, which is gaining in attendance, even his best-selling Substack. You can find everything that you need to be successful at mytalentsherpa.com.
Yeah, I spent 2 hours earlier today helping a CHRO redo their entire board presentation, and went from 7 slides that were just like way too much into 2 slides that will have everyone leaning back and saying, "Wow, they're on top of this." Boy, do I like doing that. So thanks for the pitch, Scott, and thanks to everyone who's listening. So until next time, keep raising the bar. Build the scoreboard before anybody asks you to, and keep on climbing.